The Electoral Commission of South Africa has come under intense scrutiny, particularly on social media platforms, on its handling of the 2024 general elections. While many have accepted the results, some political parties, including the MK party, have made several public utterances accusing the election management body of rigging the results. Let's have a conversation on the impact of election results denialism. We're joined this afternoon by an independent election consultant and election observer, Ben Graham-Jones, joins us from London. It's great to talk to you, Ben. Thanks very much for coming on. And these are flyaway statements, right? With such a massive impact, to question the integrity of an election that's been audited, all of the checks and balances have been done. Flyaway statements that do an incredible amount of damage.
That's exactly right, Michelle. I mean, we've seen it in the US, we've seen it in Kenya, we've seen it in the Gambia, we're seeing it everywhere. I work across so many countries, seeing how this unfolds, and it is becoming, unfortunately and regrettably, a predictable feature of elections. It's concerning, it divides people. The casting of unfounded doubt on legitimate democratic processes, it's a symptom that a democratic country can experience, and my view is that when it's identified, we need to think very deeply about how to tackle it.
And you've mentioned a whole range of countries, not just South Africa and not just the MK party here in South Africa, Ben, but in the other countries that you've mentioned, where does the election denialism come from, typically speaking, and what is the intention?
So it can sometimes be tricky to trace, and sometimes it's more obvious. There are those, of course, sometimes who are not necessarily interested in, or who don't believe it's possible for them to win an election, but who want to polarize and divide an electorate who benefit from divisions emerging between people. Other times, of course, nobody's ever happy to lose an election, and it can just be the fact that if someone is a bad loser, they might not be comfortable in just having the magnanimity to accept the results of the people. It's an insult when it emerges in that context. So there's lots of different ways in which it can emerge. But the key point that I'm bringing, and the key point that I brought in my article for Daily Maverick yesterday, was to say that when it emerges, we need to think about what we can do as a society to tackle it. Because an election is not just a process, it's also about trust in that process. We're seeing declining levels of turnout in successive elections in South Africa. This is a problem. Before we get started thinking about what the GNU is going to do in terms of policy, I think we need to give some time to think about this democratic challenge that has emerged.
And what is it that we can do, Ben? Are you talking about civil society organizations? Are you talking about watchdog organizations or ordinary citizens?
I think this needs to be a whole society approach. There's many things that can be done. Some of the actions, for example, I think immediately there needs to be an effort to understand what the claims were, how they spread, and why people, if they did believe them. Things like surveys on trust, who do people trust, what institutions are trusted, and what can be done to build that trust are going to be an important part of that. I think, secondly, it's really important to avoid for the GNU parties to avoid sort of coming down to MK's level and playing the types of denialist or divisionist cards over the coming years. They need to, I think, lead by the power of their example and show a different kind of politics, and that hopefully will help dry up some of the food on which election denial in the future might foster. I think, thirdly, when we think about when we think about some of the actual procedural challenges that were experienced, the very long queues in some polling stations, for example, these need to be addressed because wherever there are substantive procedural challenges, that gives election denial narrative spreaders the chance to say, hey, look at that, and then make false claims about those pictures or those videos. So it's really important that we think about the role that a whole range of actors can play in defeating the underlying causes of election denial.
Yeah, your article in the Daily Maverick talks about the anomalous freckle on the face of democracy. I imagine that you're comparing it to a freckle that turns out to be, in fact, something cancerous, and it's something that we ignore for a time until it's much too late. I mean, you go on to talk about, what election denial could result in, talking about even, the union buildings aflame. This is how serious this is. And I don't think perhaps even, just voters, people who are tracking the news, realize it, that it could be this cancerous thing that takes over if it's not a party of 14% like the MK party.
Yeah, and I have to think very carefully about the language here, but I do think it's important to raise an alarm on this. It's really, really serious. When people start not just criticizing their political opponents within the realm of democratic debate, totally legitimate, but start casting out the democratic process itself. We saw what happened in the United States. We've seen what's happened in other countries. People have lost lives because of election denial. Now, we have I think in South Africa, there was the good fortune to have some time to be able to address this challenge. And I hope that rather than just now that the democratic moment, the electoral moment is sort of out the way, I hope that this doesn't fade from people's minds and we sort of forget
Yeah.
about dealing with underlying causes.
Yeah, you talked about the issue of voter turnout as well, and that's sort of what's puzzling about comments that try to put into question the results of an election like the one we've just had at the end of May. So we question the election as the MK party. We allege that there's been vote rigging without substantiating any of those claims. But come 2026, and we're faced with another local government election, we ask people to go out and vote.
Exactly. I mean, you can't have it both ways, right? You can't both say that everyone's against us and the election's illegitimate and it doesn't work, and then sort of participate in the process as well. And it seems like they're maybe trying to have their cake and eat it too. Now, of course, the courts will will have the space to make their judgments, but I think it's already worth bearing in mind that legitimate fact checkers, observer missions have already weighed in many respects on this election. Just to quote one or two, AFP fact checkers has repeatedly debunked false claims that have been made about the election. ISA, a legitimate election observer group, noted substantial good practices. It noted that the process proceeded in compliance with the national laws of the country and in accordance with international standards. So there have already been highly qualified analyses that have been made of this process. And so I think it's about time that we recognise its legitimacy and move forward with the questions that South Africans, I think, are more keen to face about the policy challenges of tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even on Inauguration Day last week, it wasn't lost on the country, what it takes to get through an election, a free and fair election, and then get to an inauguration within days of the election results being declared, and all of that happening in a peaceful manner. The IEC itself faced a whole range of threats in the build-up to the election results being declared. There were threats from the floor of the Results Operations Centre by former President Jacob Zuma, the leader of the MK party, about consequences. I might be paraphrasing there, but consequences that there might be if the election results were declared in their current form. Of course, we know the IEC went ahead, declared the election results, the inauguration went ahead, despite all of these kinds of threats. Is it important for a body like the IEC, Ben, to not cow down to? Because I imagine it would have been easy for the IEC to say, do you know what? We will use the 7 days we have to declare the election results. We won't stick to our previous record of, 3 to 5 days, I think it was. But they went ahead and declared the results as well. It would have been easy for them, perhaps an easy way out for them to say, fine, we'll give it the full 7 days. But they didn't.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, there is no other response to this type of cheap behaviour, which, frankly, is so insulting to the will of a sovereign people. Than to be strong. You have to be strong in the face of this stuff. There's no election is ever going to be perfect, and there is always time, and that time must be taken for critical introspection, for thinking about, okay, what could have been done better? How can this process be improved? And for taking the relevant legal channels where there are grounds to do so. But there is no, those who believe in democracy, whoever you vote for, can do nothing more than to stand strong against those who would dismiss the process out of their own personal interest.
Ben Graham-Jones, pleasure talking to you this afternoon. He joins us from London. Ben is an independent election consultant and election observer.